I've been thinking about whether to say this, not because it's emotional, but because it's irreversible. Once something like this is said out loud, it changes how the past is understood and how the future is approached. And I don't say things lightly. I'm not the same person anymore, and you're the reason. Not in the way people usually mean that. This isn't about blame. It isn't about credit. It's about impact. The kind of impact that doesn't announce itself with drama, but quietly reorganizes how you think, decide, and move forward. Most change doesn't happen in moments. It happens in patterns. Repeated exposure to something that forces you to confront assumptions you didn't even know you were making. That's what happened here. I didn't notice the change immediately. That's important. Real change is subtle. If it's obvious why it's happening, it's usually reactive, not structural. Structural change takes time. At first, nothing but different. Same schedule, same responsibilities, same external priorities. But internally, something stopped working the way it used to. Old responses felt inefficient. I noticed that the answers I've relied on for years didn't resolve certain questions anymore. They weren't wrong, they were incomplete. And incompleteness creates friction. Friction accumulates. He didn't challenge me directly. He didn't force a confrontation. That's not how this happened. What changed me was consistency, exposure to a different way of responding, a different calibration of reality. Calibration matters. When you're exposed to a more accurate model long enough, your old model starts producing errors, not catastrophes, just small inconsistencies you can't ignore. Those inconsistencies add up. I realized that I had been operating efficiently but narrowly, optimizing outcomes while under-optimizing context that works until it doesn't. Context determines sustainability. You didn't change my goals. You changed how I evaluate them. You didn't question ambition. You reframed what it costs. Cost awareness changes decisions. I used to think transformation came from pressure, from force, from pushing harder. What I learned instead is that the most permanent changes come from clarity. Clarity doesn't push, it removes distortion. That removal is uncomfortable because distortion often protects identity. It lets you believe certain narratives without testing them too closely. Testing is disruptive but necessary. I'm not the same person anymore because I no longer default to certainty, where uncertainty is more accurate. That's a shift most people avoid. Uncertainty feels weak. It isn't. It's honest. You didn't give me answers. You made it harder for me to accept bad ones. That's the difference. Bad answers are convenient. Good questions are expensive. They demand revision. Revision is painful for systems built on continuity of self-image. I had to let go of certain internal efficiencies that were no longer true. Truth evolves. I also noticed that my emotional responses changed not because I felt more, but because I felt less threatened by feeling anything at all. Fright perception distorts behavior. When fright decreases, accuracy increases. I didn't expect that. I'd always associated control with suppression. Turns out control improves when fewer things need suppressing. Suppression is a workaround. Workarounds don't scale. You didn't make me softer, you made me more precise. That's a distinction most people miss. Precision often looks like restraint. Restraint is power. I became less reactive. Not because I cared less, but because I understood more. Understanding reduces noise. Noise triggers reaction. That's mechanical. I'm not the same person anymore because I stopped confusing endurance with strength. Endurance is surviving misalignment. Strength is correcting it. Correction is progress. That realization didn't arrive as a breakthrough. It arrived as a quiet discomfort. I didn't resolve with old tools. Old tools fail silently first. I also noticed that certain conversations became unnecessary. I stopped rehearsing defenses. I stopped anticipating conflict that never actually materialized. Anticipation without evidence is waste. Waste accumulates internally as fatigue. Fatigue distorts judgment. You change me by not demanding change. That's the paradox. There was no pressure to be different, no expectation to adapt. That absence of force revealed how much force I've been applying to myself unnecessarily. Unnecessary force degrades systems. I realized that growth doesn't always mean expansion. Sometimes it means removal, removing assumptions, removing reflexes, removing outdated interpretations of who you think you are. Identity updates are costly but unavoidable. Avoiding them creates technical debt. I had been carrying internal technical debt for years. It didn't break anything immediately, it just made everything slightly harder than it needed to be. Hard. R over time becomes unsustainable. I'm not the same person anymore because I no longer optimize solely for outcome. I optimize for integrity of process. That changes everything downstream. Process integrity scales, outcome obsession doesn't. You also changed how I interpret silence. Silence stopped meaning uncertainty. It started meaning space. Space is where understanding consolidates. Filling space prematurely creates error. I used to fill every gap with logic. Logic is useful, but it isn't always sufficient. Some things need time to resolve without interference. Interference introduces bias. Bias accumulates invisibly. I'm not the same person anymore because I no longer confuse being unaffected with being stable. Stability is responsiveness without collapse, not emotional absence. Absence is brittle. Responsiveness is resilient. This didn't make life easier in the short term. It made it more accurate. Accuracy often feels heavier at first because illusions are lighter than truth. Truth has mass, but mass creates gravity. Gravity creates structure. I don't see the world the same way anymore. Not because it changed, but because my model of it did. Models determine behavior more than intention ever will. Intentions are cheap. Models are decisive. You didn't change me by being extraordinary. You changed me by being consistent in a way that exposed inconsistency in me. Exposure drives adaptation. This is only part one. Not because there's drama ahead, but because understanding change requires layers. This first layer is recognition. Naming the fact that something fundamental has shifted. Naming matters. In the next part, I'll talk about what that change caused, what had to be unlearned, why resistance showed up, and how letting go of an old version of yourself feels less like loss and more like relief. That part matters. If this resonated like this video, if you value clarity, growth, and honest self-examination, subscribe. And if something here fell, personal, leave a comment, even a short one. Some people don't change your life by entering it loudly. They change it by making it impossible to stay the same. After recognition comes resistance. Not dramatic resistance, quiet resistance. The kind that shows up as hesitation, as second guessing, as a subtle desire to return to what was familiar, even if it was less accurate. That's where this part begins. Most people assume growth feels like momentum. It doesn't. At first, it feels like instability, like standing between two versions of yourself with no clear instruction on which one to keep. Transitions are uncomfortable by design. I noticed resistance, not because I wanted to go back, but because certain habits kept trying to reassert themselves. Old reflexes, old interpretations, old shortcuts that used to work. They didn't fail loudly, they failed quietly. Quiet failure is dangerous because it's easy to ignore. You didn't pull me forward, that's important. You didn't promise but better version of me. You didn't offer reassurance that change would be worth it. You just stayed consistent. Consistency is destabilizing to outdated systems. When something remains steady while you're changing, it removes your ability to blame external factors. Blame delays. Adaptation. Without blame, responsibility becomes unavoidable. I started noticing how often I tried to justify returning to old patterns not because they were correct, but because they were efficient. Efficiency is seductive. It reduces cognitive load. But efficiency without accuracy compounds error. That's the cost I had been avoiding. Avoidance feels like relief in the short term. In the long term, it's debt. Letting go of the old version of myself didn't feel like loss at first. It felt like friction, like something resisting deletion, because it was deeply integrated even if it was no longer useful. Legacy code behaves that way. I realized that much of my identity had been built around endurance, around toll, erating misalignment instead of correcting it. That had worked, but only because I was willing to absorb the cost internally. Absorbing cost isn't strength, it's deferral. Deferred costs always surface. You changed me by making deferral visible, not through confrontation, but through contrast. The contrast between reacting and responding, between filling space and allowing it, between control and clarity. Clarity is slower but permanent. Resistance also showed up emotionally, not as fear, but as nostalgia. Nostalgia for a version of myself that was simpler, more predictable, less exposed to revision. Predictability feels safe, but safety built on inaccuracy doesn't last. I had to unlearn the idea that consistency of self equals integrity. Integrity isn't staying the same. It's staying aligned with what's true as it evolves. Evolution is non-negotiable. Unlearning is harder than learning. Learning adds layers. Unlearning removes foundations. Removing foundations creates temporary instability. Instability isn't failure, it's transition. I noticed that once I stopped resisting that instability, something unexpected happened. Relief. Not excitement, relief. The relief of not having to maintain explanations that no longer fit. Maintenance of false narratives is exhausting. He didn't ask me to explain myself. That absence mattered. Explanation often becomes self-defense in disguise. Without the need to defend, accuracy can surface. Accuracy doesn't need protection. I also noticed that resistance wasn't just internal. Some external feedback changed. Certain people reacted differently, not because I acted dramatically, but because I stopped reinforcing expectations they were used to. Expectation collapse reveals dependency. That was uncomfortable, but discomfort isn't damage. It's signal. It tells you where systems were relying on outdated versions of you to remain stable. That stability wasn't real. I'm not the same person anymore because I stopped optimizing for how I will offend, the impulse to be understood immediately. Those impulses are expensive. They're signals of internal uncertainty. When uncertainty decreases, those signals quiet down. You stop narrating your decisions in advance. You stop optimizing for interpretation. You trust the model you're operating from. Trust simplifies behavior. I'm not the same person anymore because I stopped needing to be right in the old way. Being right used to mean winning an argument or arriving at a conclusion quickly. Now it means being aligned with reality even when that takes longer. Speed without accuracy is waste. Identity recalibration doesn't feel like empowerment at first. It feels like ambiguity, like standing in a room you recognize, but can't yet navigate in the dark. That disorientation is temporary. What replaces it is something more durable than confidence. Internal consistency. Fewer contradictions between what you think, what you say, and what you do. Consistency reduces friction. Friction drains an end. Ectical. Another change. My relationship with doubt shifted. Doubt didn't disappear, but it stopped feeling threatening. It became informationational, a prompt to examine assumptions rather than panic. Panic short-circuits thinking. Information improves it. That shift alone changes everything. Identity recalibration also meant letting go of certain narratives about myself. Narratives are convenient. They compress complexity into stories you can repeat. But stories go stale. Reality keeps updating. If identity doesn't update with it, tension builds. I have been carrying outdated narratives because they worked once. They no longer did. Letting them go felt like loss until it felt like relief. Relief is often misread as emptiness. It isn't. Space. Space is where new coherence forms. I also noticed that my tolerance for performative intensity dropped. Loud certainty, forced enthusiasm, overconfident predictions. Those things used to impress me. They don't anymore, not because I'm cynic, but because I've seen what survives long enough to matter. Survival filters illusions quickly. Illusions are brittle. Being changed by someone doesn't mean losing yourself. That's the fear people carry. It means losing inaccuracies you mistook for identity. Accuracy feels smaller at first, then it feels lighter. Lightness increases capacity. I'm not the same person anymore because I stopped mistaking pressure for progress. Pressure creates motion, progress creates direction. Direction compounds. This recalibration also affected how I handle praise and criticism. Praise stopped inflating. Criticism stopped wounding. Both became data. Data informs improvement. Improvement doesn't need applause. Most people outsource self-assessment. They wait for feedback to know what they are. That's unstable. Feedback is noisy. Internal coherence is quieter but reliable. I didn't expect this to happen. I thought being changed would feel dramatic. It didn't. If procedural, like a system update running in the background while everything else continued. That's how durable updates work. You don't interrupt function, they improve it. I also noticed that confidence stopped being about asserting myself and started being about restraint, knowing when not to act, when to wait, when to let something resolve without interference. Restraint is misunderstood. It isn't hesitation, it's selectivity. Selectivity increases effectiveness. This version of me doesn't need to convince anyone. Convincing is often compensation for doubt. When doubt fades, persuasion becomes unnecessary. Unnecessary effort is waste. Waste accumulates as fatigue. Fatigue distorts decisions. Identity recalibration also changed how I think about growth. Growth stopped being additive. It became subtractive, removing what doesn't belong. removing reflexes that no longer serve. Subtraction clarifies. Clarity reduces conflict. Conflict reduction isn't avoidance, it's design. You didn't teach me this, you embodied it. That's the difference. Embodied models change behavior faster than explanations ever could. Explanation informs, embodiment transforms. I'm not the same person anymore because I stopped defending the past version of myself. Defense keeps systems frozen. Letting go allows evolution. Evolution doesn't negotiate, it proceeds. I also noticed that certainty became more conditional. I stopped speaking in absolutes, not because I'm unsure, but because reality rarely is. Conditional thinking is more accurate. Accuracy beats confidence. When conditions change, conditions always change. This part of the process is quiet. There's no announcement that you've changed. No milestone that confirms it, just a growing sense that old reactions don't fit anymore. That mismatch is permanent. Once seen, it can't be unseen. That's how identity updates lock in. This third layer is about recalibration. How confidence becomes quieter, identity becomes cleaner, and change stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like alignment. Alignment stabilizes. In the next part, I'll talk about what happens when this new identity meets the world, how relationships adjust, why some connections strengthen while others fade, and how change tests what's actually compatible with who you're becoming. Compatibility reveals itself under change. If this part helped you understand change differently, like this video. If you value clarity, restraint, and growth without performance, subscribe. And if any of this mirrors your own recalibration, leave a comment, even a short one. Some transformations don't make you louder, they make you precise. And that's when everything starts to work better. After identity recalibrates, the next thing that changes is interaction. Not immediately and not dramatically. It changes in the margins, in how conversations start and how they end, and what no longer needs to be said. That's when you find out what's compatible. Compatibility isn't revealed when everything is going well. It's revealed when you stop performing, when you stop compensating, when you show up as the updated version of yourself without explaining the update. Some connections adjust this resist. I noticed this first in small exchanges, a pause where there used to be reassurance, a neutral response where there used to be urgency, a boundary where there used to be accommodation. Nothing aggressive, nothing dramatic, just different. Difference is enough to test structures. People often think relationships break because of conflict. That's rarely true. Most relationships strain because one system updates and the other expects backward compatibility. Backward compatibility is expensive. When you change, you stop reinforcing patterns that others relied on, sometimes without realizing it. You stop filling emotional gaps. You stop translating yourself. You stop anticipating reactions. That absence is felt. Not everyone welcomes it. I noticed that some people leaned in. They adapted, they asked better questions. They adjusted their expectations without resentment. That's alignment. Others didn't. They pushed back, not directly, but subtly. Increased pressure, old jokes, familiar narratives trying to pull me back into a previous role. Roles are comfortable, change disrupts them. Disruption reveals dependence. This is where growth becomes social, not just internal. You don't just discover who you are, you discover who can meet you there. Meeting you there requires effort. I realize that being changed by someone doesn't just alter your internal model. It changes the entire relational ecosystem around you. Some connections become easier, others become heavier. Weight is diagnostic. What feels heavier usually required you to carry more than you realized. I also noticed that I became less available for misalignment. Not because I was distant, but because I no longer had the bandwidth to sustain friction that served no purpose. Bandwidth is finite. When clarity increases, tolerance for noise decreases. That's not arrogance, it's efficiency. Efficiency reveals mismatches. Efficiency reveals mismatches. Some people interpreted the change as coldness, others as distance. Neither was accurate. What they were responding to was the removal of unnecessary accommodation. Accommodation can look like kindness. It can also be avoidance. Avoidance keeps systems stable at the cost of truth. Truth destabilizes before it stabilizes. I noticed that conversations became more precise. Fewer qualifiers, less hedging, less emotional buffering. That precision didn't always land comfortably. Precision removes ambiguity. Ambiguity protects misalignment. Removing it forces adjustment. What surprised me was how some relationships improved dramatically. Without the old patterns in place, new dynamics emerged. Simpler ones, clearer ones, clearer ones. Clearly reduces conflict. Those relationships didn't need me to be who I was. They met who I am. That difference matters. I'm not the same person anymore, and the world doesn't respond to me the same way. That's inevitable. When you change how you operate, you change how systems interact with you. Interaction is reciprocal. I also noticed that my tolerance for emotional negotiation dropped. Not negotiation toward understanding, but negotiation toward understanding, but negotiation to maintain comfort. Comfort maintenance is costly. It often delays necessary change. I stopped trying to be accessible in ways that weren't accurate. That created space, sometimes uncomfortable space. But space is where recalibration happens. Crowded systems can't adapt. Huh? This is where many people get scared and revert. They mistake relational tension for personal error. They think maybe I changed too much. That question misses the point. Change doesn't ask permission from compatibility. Compatibility is tested by change. I realized that some connections were built on who I was willing to be, not who I actually was. When ruining was removed, the structure collapsed. That collapse wasn't a failure, it was exposure. Exposure clarifies reality. I also noticed that new boundaries didn't require enforcement, they required consistency. I didn't need to explain them repeatedly, I just had to maintain them. Maintenance communicates seriousness. Explanation invites negotiation. Consistency sets expectation. Expectations shape behavior. Another shift. Feedback changed. Some people stopped offering advice. Others offered better advice. The difference was whether they were responding to the old me or the updated one. Updates change interfaces. Not everyone refreshes. Those who don't experience errors. I'm not the same person anymore because I no longer shape myself to preserve connections that depend on my inaccuracy. Inaccuracy is expensive. Accuracy can be lonely at first, but it's sustainable. I noticed that my energy stabilized, fewer emotional spikes, less recovery time after interactions. That told me something important. Much of my previous fatigue came from relational friction, not workload. Misattributed fatigue leads to bad optimization. Once identified, it can be corrected. Correction improves lifespan. I also noticed that I stopped seeking approval for change. Approval delays. Evolutio. N. If growth requires consensus, it won't happen. Consensus favors stasis. Evolution favors accuracy. Evolution favors accuracy. Accuracy isn't democratic. Some people interpreted my change as distance, others as clarity. The difference was whether they'd benefited from the old ambiguity. Ambiguity serves someone. Clarity removes hidden advantages. That's why it's resisted. I didn't plan to say this because it forces a difficult realization. Not everyone who knew you is meant to know the next version of you. Versions matter. Relationships are version specific. Compatibility isn't permanent. It's conditional on growth paths. When paths diverge, tension appears. You can force convergence or acknowledge divergence. Forcing creates distortion. Acknowledgement creates honesty. Honesty simplifies decisions. I chose honesty. This stage isn't about cutting people off, it's about letting dynamics reveal themselves without interference. Letting behaviors speak louder than intention. Behavior is the signal always. Some relationships strengthened because they were built on mutual adaptation. Others weakened because they required one person to remain static. Static systems fail under change. Change is the constant. Resilience is adaptation. Not the same person anymore, and the world adjusted accordingly. Not all at once, not cleanly, but truth rarely reorganizes without friction. Friction is part of the process. This fourth layer is about compatibility under change, how growth tests relationships, why not all connections survive accuracy, and how stability emerges when you stop negotiating your evolution. Evolution continues. Whether others follow is information, not a verdict. In the out part, I'll talk about integration, what remains after the dust settles, how a changed self learns to operate without explanation, and why being changed by someone doesn't end with separation or closeness. It ends with coherence. Shed this one said, after compatibility reveals itself and the noise settles, what remains is an emptiness. It's coherence, not the kind you announce, but the kind you operate from without thinking about it. That's the end state most people never name. They assume change ends when things feel resolved. It doesn't. Resolution is a feeling. Coherence is a condition. When coherence arrives, you stop checking whether you're okay being who you are. You just are. This is where the transformation completes, not with excitement, not with relief, but with a quiet sense of rightness. Not certainty about outcome, certainty about alignment with reality. Reality doesn't negotiate, it responds. And now so do you. I'm not the same person anymore because I no longer need to integrate the change consciously. It's integrated. It shows up in default decisions, in what I ignore, in what I don't explain. Defaults tell the truth. When defaults change, identity has already shifted. You don't need affirmation. You don't need permission. You don't need to revisit the reasons. Reasons serve their purpose, and there's function. Function sustains, function sustains. I noticed that life didn't become easier. It became simpler. There's a difference. Ease implies lack of challenge. Simplicity implies lack of unnecessary friction. Friction was the real cost. With coherence, friction drops. You stop second-guessing responses that fit. You stop overthinking reactions that are curate. You stop editing yourself for compatibility that no longer exists.